Welcome back for the second season of the DDI podcast, where we're speaking to leading industry experts to help us in our mission to demystify misconceptions surrounding digital infrastructure. I am your host, Mark Eels, the Vice President for Schneider Electric's Secure Power Division here in the UK and Ireland. And today I'm delighted to host Arun Shenoy, CMO and SVP Sales for Server Farm, an award-winning data center developer and operator. Arun is a former colleague here of mine at Schneider Electric and has been in the industry over 20 years and has a highly successful track record in software, services, and technology markets. He has described data centers as the landlords of the internet, and I'm looking forward to talking about this in more detail today and why the environmental implications of technology are vital for us all to understand. So Arun, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Lovely to be here.
You're very welcome. So maybe for those of our listeners who are probably a little unsure about Server Farm, could you give us a quick background intro and maybe share your personal journey into this sector? That would be great.
Sure. So Server Farm, about 25 years old, an owner-operator of data centers primarily in North America and a number of countries in EMEA. We have a couple of kind of interesting claims to fame. In all of the time that we've been operating as a business, we've built one new data center. So a big part of what Server Farm has done in 25 years is really to, repurpose existing assets, whether they were data centers previously owned by others, whether they were manufacturing plants. We have an old North American nuclear missile control center that is now, our data center, very perfectly called Titan. A facility in Chicago, a multi-story downtown building in Chicago that was, not previously a data center. So that's always been our focus. And so odd as it might sound, we've had an eye on sustainability for 25 years. I guess that eye has just become bigger. There's a much larger magnifying glass, as we know, on that particular topic, and I know that we'll touch on that. But the other part of our business is we also operate data centers on behalf of our customers. So we operate around 800 locations in 43 countries, where Server Farm doesn't necessarily own the physical asset itself, but we extend our operating capabilities, both in facility and IT, into our customers as a service. So that's kind of Server Farm, privately held. And as I said, we've been kicking around this industry for about 25 years. I guess my own journey started a long time ago. I'm very much an IT person that has sort of found myself in kind of the sort of non-IT part of this, this little sort of infrastructure industry. But I started at IBM and Intel in the 80s, would you believe, and the 90s. Very much, so qualified as an electronic engineer, focused very much on hardware engineering. I wanted to go into chip design in my early days at university. Discovered software in my final year at university. Most people told me that I'd sort of moved to the dark side. I have to say that I probably agree with them. But I was just fascinated by software much more than hardware then. And sort of followed that. Intel for a long time, number of software companies, moved towards, as I said, kind of the more sort of physical infrastructure side buildings with a software business at ABB. Spent some time as colleagues of, you and others at Schneider prior to joining Server Farm roughly 6 years ago. I've been here since.
Wow. Well, what a journey. So
I started when I was 3, obviously. So,
Yeah, naturally. Yeah, naturally. What fascinates me, I think, Arun, about the journey of a number of peers in the industry, especially in this sector, is how often the sector is not the place of the starting line, actually. It just lands on people or people land on it. So that's fascinating to hear your story. I do have to move us on to picking up on your great statement, which is data centers being the landlords of the internet. I wonder if you could help our listeners understand this. What do you mean by this? And how can we better communicate this idea, not just like I say internally into our own sector, but the people that probably really matter when we're talking about some of the relationships we need to have with a whole ecosystem. So I'm thinking the general public, a younger generation of people who've lived their whole lives using the internet. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a lot like sort of businesses in general, where, people talk about overnight successes and realize that most overnight successes take, anywhere between 10 and 20 years to, to come to fruition. And I think the internet is similar, but I think most people think about the internet as something that you use to consume content. And whether in the early days of the internet, that content was, things like very simple email or very simple web browsing, or very simple file sharing. We tend to have the view of the internet from a consumer perspective as being, the device that we're using to access whatever it is that we're accessing. And again, I'm sort of generalizing on behalf of the wider audience. If you think sort of slightly beyond that, you might sort of consider the network that the device is connected to. You might think about, your broadband connection at home and how that might behave. But I think generally speaking, very little thought is given. And not surprisingly, it's not, we're not expecting people to sort of become technical wizards in terms of internet architecture. But generally speaking, very little thought is given to, what is the surrounding infrastructure behind the broadband connection that arrives in your home? How is that managed? How is it made reliable? How does it scale? Who pays for it? How is it deployed? Because as soon as you get outside of your home, you're suddenly in a world of physical infrastructure that requires roads to be dug up and ducts to be put in, in trenches and, across railway lines or along railway lines or alongside roads and so on and so forth. And in amongst all of that infrastructure are large buildings that house and concentrate a lot of the compute and storage capacity that makes up the internet. When you do an internet search, it is looking at hundreds, maybe thousands of these pools of storage and compute capacity to find information. I remember in very late 90s when I was at Intel, I went to a sales conference. And for those of you who had young children at the time, you'll probably remember the movie Bug's Life. Intel did a take on Bug's Life called A Bit's Life. And the idea was that it was a CGI sort of base movie, very short, 4 or 5 minutes. But what it did was to follow a bit as it traversed the internet. So somebody pressed a button, asked for something, and it followed the bit and how it went through all of the various networks and gateways and routers along the way, how it touched a server, how the server had to go and get something from, a storage device. And it was fascinating that we were spending time at Intel internally educating ourselves on what the internet was. But I think one of the things that the technology industry failed to do is it failed to talk to the wider population about what the internet was. We sort of took the outcome of the internet for granted, but forgot to tell people, what was involved in building an internet.
Why is that important, Arun?
Well, I think it has become important now, I think for a couple of reasons. One is that digital infrastructure is now something that is of not just national, but global importance. Now that most services are being digitized, now that more automation from an IT perspective is being used to run manufacturing, to do education, to deliver government services, to do healthcare, to do banking, everything has an ability to touch and be touched by the internet. So the internet has become all pervasive. And I think going back to one of my earlier comments, I think in the process of not helping the wider audience understand the internet, I think the technology industry also forgot to help governments understand the broader internet. And so this concept of digital infrastructure, frankly, is not new, but is now something that governments are having to think about because it suddenly involves grid infrastructure in a country. It involves telecom infrastructure in a country. It involves STEM education in a country. It involves jobs that might previously have been in manufacturing sectors that are now in the technology sector. And I think there are very, very few examples of governments that have sort of really started to pull these things together. So I think to a certain extent, we are playing catch up as an industry. And by industry, I'm really talking about, the technology industry. So not just the data center building side of the equation, but also the IT side of the equation, what goes into those buildings.
And when you think about, and I agree with you wholeheartedly on this, so can you share a perspective on how we could better communicate to maybe, if you start in, this is today, how do we better communicate with the general public and maybe younger gen who we might want to kind of encourage maybe even to come and work in this industry?
It is actually very difficult. I think there's a couple of things that we really need to think through very carefully. I think we have to stop being defensive, because I think the challenge with being defensive is that it sometimes validates an argument where an argument shouldn't exist. So, we might read a newspaper headline that talks about data centers, in a particularly negative way. And I think we tend to jump to the defense of the industry. And so potentially sort of address something that might never have been intended to begin an argument, but we sometimes help sort of perpetuate that by becoming perhaps very sort of explanatory in terms of what we do. And I think what we don't do enough of is really describe the value of what digital infrastructure means for everyone and the role that data centers play within digital infrastructure, whether it is at a regional level, a country level, a global level. I think that's the bit that we've forgotten how to do. Well, I say forgotten. I don't know whether we've ever known how to do that, because one of the things about technologists is, we love technology. I guess in part we exist because we love technology. And so it's not necessarily in our gift to be equally good at sort of explaining to a layperson what that means. We don't, for example, expect consumers to understand how the banking system works. But by and large, they don't tend to think about the bank. Well, maybe they do. By and large, they don't tend to think about the banking system as some kind of bad thing. So there is certainly a PR job to be done. But as I said, I think we have to do that very positively. I think we've got to sort of step away from this sort of very defensive position that we know what we're doing. You don't understand it. I can't explain it to you because you'd never understand it. And we have to step away from that. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that all of us are there, but some of us are, by the way.
No, I think there's some merit in what you're saying here, Hey, because the rhetoric around our sector is varied. I was only having a conversation this morning talking about our language around how to address is the wrong word probably, but how to kind of say, you know what, we're doing loads of great things. Let me talk to the world about the real positive things that this industry does. And how the fourth utility seriously is important. And talking about fourth utilities and thinking about optimization, you've previously spoken about how data center developments are generally viewed through, and this is probably a shift change in the last few years, but generally viewed through the lens of sustainability, be that good or bad. Can you maybe elaborate further for us and share what you believe is maybe compounding, if there is a problem, compounding the problem?
So I think you're right. So that lens does get applied, but I think it's also fair to say that that is not the lens that everyone is applying. So, for example, those of us in the industry who, have either spent a very, very long time doing it as business as usual, or those that are entering the market to do that. And that business as usual is, how do we build data center capacity that is as efficient as possible? Efficient in its use of raw materials, efficient in its use of construction methods, efficient in terms of its design and build, efficient in terms of operations. Now, I'm not suggesting that the server farm way is the only way, but it is one fantastic way of doing that, where, we frankly recycle buildings. For the most part, other than the one new data center that we've built so far, we don't have to construct buildings. We can use a building that's 20 years old or 30 years old, because as long as a building has been built well, it has a life cycle that is significantly longer than most IT refreshes. That doesn't usually become something for us to worry about. I think the lens on sustainability, though, I think has become a way of looking at the industry from the outside that is frankly, I guess there's an element of fashion to it. Let's call it that. Because the same people that are looking at our industry from a sustainability perspective are perhaps not looking at it from all of the angles. And there are always motivations in terms of why someone might choose to word something in a certain way. But again, I think it goes back to our responsibilities in industry to really help people understand why we exist. So if I go back to the landlords of the internet, you can look at the applications that run the internet and the IT infrastructure that runs the internet as a tenant that requires a building to reside in. And for the most part, data center owner and operators like Server Farm are the landlords of those buildings. I don't think we have a single building. There are very, very, very few data centers that exist as, as sort of standalone islands of capacity. they're ultimately all connected to the internet. So every single one of those buildings is a landlord. And in the same way that tenants are growing in terms of their requirements and their number, so too must the number of landlords. The two things have to go hand in hand.
Very, very interesting. And when I think about that lens on sustainability, it is my belief, having only been in the industry maybe 10, 11 months now, but the power, I think, of this industry comes from us as a collective. And there's an opportunity here to collaborate more to maybe change and drive decarbonisation. Am I missing a point here? How do you think we can begin to accelerate sustainable action rather than maybe just calling for the change? Because that's the easy bit.
It is. But you know what, Mark? It's actually not that difficult to do sustainability from a data center perspective. And for the most part, the data center market has been doing this for all of its time. Was it perfect to begin with? No. Is it perfect now? No, not yet. But is it on the right path? Absolutely. Now, having said that, those are all wonderful platitudes that every industry will probably say when describing itself. But let's think a little bit about some of the very, very rapid change that has taken place in our lifetime. So in the last 25 years, internet traffic, internet users, the volume of data on the internet, the volume of applications on the internet, the two-way nature of the internet in terms of how it is now compared to how it was when it first started, that has grown by many orders of magnitude. But the energy consumption of data centers has not grown many orders of magnitude. And so I think what we have lost sight a little bit of is that the data center market has become more sustainable and more efficient much faster than the rate of growth of the internet. In other words, per bit of traffic or per gigabyte of data stored or per something of whatever computed, the data center infrastructure part of that has become a smaller proportion of the overall footprint. And that, I think, is really important to recognize, because if we had tracked internet growth, frankly, we'd be using more electricity than the Earth could generate, certainly is capable of generating today. That's an important message, I think, for us to get out there. The other message, as I said, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is there are some very sort of obvious common themes in terms of people either reducing the demand that they place on infrastructure, reusing infrastructure, where possible. And if they can't reduce or they don't have the ability to reuse, recycling that infrastructure in terms of giving it some kind of second life. And whether that is a second life of IT hardware. So as an example, a lot of the large hyperscalers will, at the end of their own technology refresh cycle, will effectively make some of their infrastructure available on the open market for people who perhaps don't have quite the same performance requirements, so that equipment has a second life. And there's a whole bunch of organizations around the world that help that hardware to be reused and have a second, and in some cases even a third use. And those things are, as I said, incredibly important. But I think going back to the sustainability question, I think it goes hand in hand with making sure that our wider audience understands why data centers exist. And data centers exist because they are as important as housing. They're as important as public transportation. They're as important as public services. They're as important as health. And I think that's the bit where we need to do a much better job as an industry, because all of those things that I mentioned, public sector, the transportation, health, banking, they all need digital infrastructure. And that digital infrastructure can't exist. At least we haven't found a way of making that digital infrastructure exist or work without us, the landlords of the internet, managing those, owning and operating those buildings.
That's a super interesting point, actually. And again, I think you're making some valid statements here. And in particular, for me, the one that resonates most is the PR and the PR around how we explain and tell the message. So I will take that away from me from today's show. I do want to ask you, kind of get back onto you a little bit in your career and think about, when you look back and you reflect a little bit on your pathway journey, whichever way you want to call it right now, what advice would you offer to maybe a young professional who's just starting out in tech, and what would you say to them? And then the second part of my question is, how do we get more of those young people want to pursue a career in data centers, sustainability, or renewables? How does that happen? Two parts of the question then, really. So what's your guidance and how do we attract?
Well, I think the important thing is understanding, and I don't want to sort of labor the sort of the landlord topic, but let's just think about the sort of topic of landlords and tenants. Both need each other. And frankly, one, the landlord, exists because of the other. If there were no tenants, there would be no landlords. But also, if there were no landlords, the tenants would struggle to find somewhere to live. And I think for those that are considering technology as an option, and technology in the broadest sense, is that technology in the large scale, building out the very large systems that manage and transport, electricity around the country, all the way down to technology at a chip level and how it is put together with other things to make IT hardware. So I think those the choices and the options in terms of what technology represents as a career opportunity are vast. Everything from software engineering to hardware engineering, in both the IT side of the building, so the tenant side, or the landlord side, which is, much more sort of mechanical and electrically driven from an engineering perspective. And I think to your point, how do we attract people? I think we have to describe this industry in terms of its connectivity into every single thing that we do every single day. I was going to say other than sleep, but think about people that wear sleep tracking devices. Frankly, those devices would be able to do very, very little if they weren't in some way connected to a larger data set to offer the analytics of you slept better or worse than the people in your sort of plus or minus 2-year age range. So, everything that we do is touched by digital infrastructure in some way. And I think that's the bit of PR that we have to do. I don't think we have to tell people this is how you build a data center. Frankly, if they're interested in that, they'll be interested in it. But that isn't the case that everybody should be or needs to be. I think what we do have to do is to place ourselves in their everyday lives and say, the reason we exist is so that you can do all of these things.
I think this is a really interesting point, Aaron, because there's a piece of PR work that needs to be done, but I think it needs to be as simply explained as possible and almost talk about the outcome of what is happening here. The infrastructure is really interesting. And to your point, I get interested in it. You get interested in it. But actually, for maybe some early talents, the notion that, I see now this fourth utility, this is what's powering all this stuff. And actually, by powering this stuff, I can start to affect change in these areas. And I think that's a super way of us thinking about this. I want to take you into the future now. So we're going to do Tomorrow's World, but in 2024, if you remember that program.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing a bit of future gazing. In your mind, what's the next disruptive force in tech? And how do you think that's going to affect people in general and maybe what you do as a business?
So I'm going to steer clear of AI and robotics and things like that, because frankly, they are fantastically well covered. And whilst we are, in our own way as a company, landlords of companies doing exactly those things in very, very technologically advanced ways, I think there is something much bigger in terms of sort of our contribution to, and you talked about it, the fourth utility. I think one of the reasons why the fourth utility should be the fourth utility is because it's a utility. And I think that becomes very, very important when that fourth utility starts to produce rather than only consume. And one of the things that we're looking at very, very seriously is how do we build data centers that produce electricity as much as they might consume them one day in the future? I mean, it's a very kind of straightforward concept in the sense that we are strong believers that data centers can be the anchor tenant for sustainability developments in the first place and absolutely should be part of a contributor to the grid, perhaps from a sort of micro grid point of view. And I think we're getting to the stage where there are now technological capabilities that allow that to happen that are not dirty in terms of their environmental footprint. Now, there's a long way to go, so I'm not suggesting that we're going to go and sort of plonk small modular reactor wherever we might build a data center, but that is one of the options that we're looking at. And that is, rather than simply wait for the grid to be built, wait for the grid to be strengthened, wait for the grid's capacity to be expanded, and then build a data center? Why not build a data center where we produce clean, renewable power ourselves, offer the surplus back to the grid? Because frankly, if you can build that kind of capability, you actually strengthen the grid. And you don't strengthen the grid simply by creating more capacity. You strengthen the grid because you're starting to diversify where the production takes place. Now, there are some technological hurdles to get through, of course. There are also some environmental ones to get through. And the environmental ones aren't just about things like carbon footprint, but they have to do with where in the world should these facilities exist? How might they coexist with residential or industrial or logistics parks, for example? How might they contribute to things like district heating schemes or even district power schemes? And that, I think, is something that not only strengthens our posture, our capacity as the fourth utility, but actually makes us a contributor to the other utilities. And I think that's very, very important. So we can't simply just be at the end of a piece of string, permanently tugging on it, saying, I need more, I need more. I think we have to give as much as we take.
I've enjoyed that last piece because it made me think back to another conversation I'd had recently, just talking about where are we building our data centers? How are we building our data centers? And do we have better capacity, more capacity, greener capacity in terms of power to think about where we're going to put these buildings in the future? Arun, I just wanted to say a big thank you for joining me today, number one, and number two, to giving us some really invaluable insights. And landlords of the internet is the strap line I'm going to take away from this pod. So thanks for joining today.
Mark, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much.